Greetings, artist. Mrs. Schmidt here. This week we're going to talk about space, perspective, and proportion. Specifically, our project will deal with one-point perspective, so dealing with what we call linear perspective. Let's take a look at what we got here. So first we're going to look at an image and assess how does this artist show perspective or space. Now, notice the size. Certainly, we have learned over the years that things that are close up look larger than things that are far in the distance. Things gradually get smaller as they move further away from the viewer. So as you can see, we have several people here that are quite large scale. We can tell that they are close to the viewer. In addition, as people move back into space, they get smaller and things become less clear as well, less detailed. You can see more details on the people in the front of the artwork and less detail into the distance. In addition, you'll notice overlapping. Obviously, those individual or objects that are in front will overlap those things that are behind. In addition, we have some terms. And you might be familiar with background. We tend to think of, okay, we have a subject kind of in the front, and then there's maybe a background, maybe a scenery or something in the background. Well, here we can see, obviously, that they're at the beach based on the water in the background. Middle ground is kind of that middle area in the picture plane, okay? Things that are kind of midway between the background and the foreground. And the foreground, which let's try and move this so you can see the term. Foreground means the area in the artwork that is closest to the viewer. So again, we have foreground, closest, middle ground, kind of midway, and background is the furthest. Here we see some images that show foreshortening. Now, kind of depending on when the artwork was created, kind of depends on the success of the foreshortening. Foreshortening is when, you're kind of like this image of Christ laying here. It says, lamentation over the dead Christ. Obviously, the viewer, we are closest to Christ's feet, and his head is furthest from us. But his feet look rather small. Usually those things that are closest to the viewer are larger and things that are further away are smaller. I would say his feet look rather small to me, and his rib cage and his head look rather large based on the fact that they are further away. Now, granted, this was painted in 1475 through 78. So over time, artists learned more and more about perspective. And so anyhow, granted, the artist may have chosen to make the face larger to make it more, give it more importance. But we don't know, ultimately know. It could be that it's just an assumption was made that this was more accurate. But I think, as we know, if we put our hand right by our face, it can cover up a whole person, basically. If I'm looking and I have my hand in front of me, there could be a person standing in the distance, and my hand could cover up that whole person. But if I move my hand away from me, all of a sudden it takes on a whole different size because of the distance from my face. Next, let's look at this image on the right. It's called Conversion of St. Paul. Now, this one was painted a bit later in the 1600s. It was painted by Caravaggio. Now, I would say the foreshortening looks much more successful to me, much more realistic. I don't know if you feel the same way, but here we see Paul, who was once Saul until he became a follower of Christ, has fallen off his horse because he's been blinded by the light of Jesus. And so, anyhow, that's kind of what's going on in this picture. But we see a foreshortened Paul. The head and the body kind of in this diagonal pose where we're not seeing him from the side or straight from the front, but we are seeing him foreshortened. Now, how does this artist show space? We're kind of revisiting this. If we think about proportion is the ratio of relationship of one part to another part, or the relationship of one part to the whole. So this is a very famous image that you've probably seen before by Leonardo da Vinci here on the right side. It is called Vitruvian Man, and it was created in 1490. This has to do with proportion of the human body. If we look at the arms held straight out and the legs straight down, this proportion creates what we would consider like a square. The length of our arms spread out actually is the same length as our height. So that is being illustrated here. In addition, Da Vinci also focuses on if we spread our legs and then our arms kind of outward and kind of angle them a bit, it creates the proportion that creates a circle. So again, very interesting. I actually am posting a video about this, which actually reveals even more of kind of a mathematical proportion element to it as well. It's a 3-minute video and it's definitely worth a watch. All right, so let's explore perspective a little bit more. First of all, perspective is the technique artists use to project an illusion of the 3D world onto a 2-dimensional or 2D surface. Perspective helps to create a sense of depth, of space that is receding. Now, we can consider it in 2 different ways. Linear perspective uses lines and math to capture receding space that's going off into the distance. Atmospheric perspective mimics the way our eyes depict the distance. So let's take a look at this image here. We have actually 2 images. So we have an image here of Christ on the cross and called the Crucifixion. This was painted in the 1300s, and really you can tell there's pretty much just activity going on in the foreground, again, closest to the viewer. Everyone, it's very shallow space. There's not really anything in the distance or anything in the background, and that creates a very shallow sense of space. If we look at this one here called the Trinity, and this was painted in 1427, much different feel. Certainly we have just much more realism in the figures. There's a lot more shadow created by the artist as well on the figures. But then we also see these architectural structures that employ linear perspective, again, giving a greater sense of depth. Now, in Google Classroom, you will find an image that looks like this, and I'd like you to explore this. This won't take you long. You'll need to use a ruler and a marker or a pen and trace the compositional lines from the architecture and ground. You might be like, what? So if you follow my little cursor here, you can see this kind of edge going around the building would be a straight line, as well as this kind of edge to the building, another straight line where the roof kind of starts to dome. You'd see here, again, horizontal lines that kind of follow the edges or angles of the building. But as things go into the distance, what happens to the lines? Okay, they go off at an angle. So use your ruler and your marker or your pen and follow those lines. Okay, I want you to describe or observe the lines and how they're organized. What do you notice? And why do you think the artist organized the lines in this way? Let's explore linear perspective. As we know, things that are closer up look larger and things that are further away look smaller. So this is very easily seen in a road that goes off into the distance. In addition, we have something called a horizon line, which you might recognize that term, and the very point here in the middle is what we call the vanishing point. If things go so far in the distance, they will eventually vanish to that point. So let's look at this piece by Raphael. It's called School of Athens and it was painted in 1510. We see many great thinkers presented in this image, but look at the architecture. It's, first of all, very impressive. Certainly, the detail is incredible, but what really is going on here from a structural standpoint? Certainly, we have vertical lines for the walls, and obviously horizontal lines for the floor. And also, you might notice this solid line here we would consider a horizon line, where the sky and the ground meet. Now, we have special names for these lines. So we have orthogonal lines, which go diagonally and kind of lead to the vanishing point. We have the vanishing point here at the intersection. Horizon line is where the sky and the ground meet. And then we also have what we call transverse lines, which are the vertical and the horizontal lines that kind of continue to support the rest of that structure. I'm going to have you guys spend some time doing some one-point perspective. There is an excellent tutorial that I would love for you to either follow. You can follow along and just do the exact same thing to help you understand how to go about drawing in perspective, or you can watch it, learn from it, maybe use it as a beginning for either an imaginary room that you want to draw, or you can draw a space within your house that is using one-point perspective. So I will make sure in your Google Classroom you will see a link for this drawing a room in one-point perspective. And so that will be your assignment for this week.